Now this is one of the best, strongest, and fastest Bash Barbarian build in Season 4. With this build you can easily clear multiple tier 100 plus pits and destroy any Uber bosses, even Uber Lilith. With this build I focus on speed, damage, and capping out all my defensive stats, and I highly recommend you to watch this video from the beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you clearing a tier 101 pit. I can easily speedrun tier 101 pits and get tons of materials and items. This build is so strong that it can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and shred bosses. Now with this build I did cap out my movement speed so I can easily dodge attacks and speedrun dungeons. This build can easily handle any Uber bosses, and I even carried more than 100 people on Uber Lilith. I also capped out my armor and all the elemental resistance for maximum toughness. Now this is an endgame build, so ideally you want to be level 100 and will need to masterwork your gear if you want to easily clear tier 100 plus pits and destroy Uber bosses. And I do switch one skill around if I plan to push the highest tier pits by adding more survivability, but I'll go over everything in more details in their dedicated sections. Okay, so next for the skills. Now our main damage dealing skill is Bash, and this basic skill is so strong that it can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and any Uber bosses. And if you check out the modifiers, if we damage stun enemies with Bash, we'll gain Fortify, and critically striking 4 times with Bash will grant your next core skill Overpower. And we want to overpower with our core skill Hammer of the Ancients to gain additional damage. The next skill I'm using is Hammer of the Ancients, and we're only using this skill for the modifier, which states after overpowering with Hammer of the Ancients, you deal 30% more damage for 5 seconds. So we're not using Hammer of the Ancients for attacking, but just to gain the additional 30% damage. The next skill I'm using is Steel Grasp, and this skill is really important because Steel Grasp will make enemies vulnerable, and it will also gain you berserking for 2 seconds. And Steel Grasp will pull groups of enemies towards you, making it really easy to eliminate them. And the next skill I'm using is Rallying Cry, and this skill will grant you Unstoppable and grant you Fortify, which is really good for defense and survivability. And the next skill I'm using is War Cry, and this skill will greatly increase your damage, and also War Cry will grant you berserking. And the last skill I'm using is the ultimate skill Call of the Ancients. Now we're only using this skill for the modifiers, which states while Call of the Ancients is active, gain 20% attack speed and 20% increased damage. And next for the weapon expertise, I'm using the two-handed axe expertise for the 10% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Okay, so next for the skill tree. Now for this skill tree, I did focus on speed farming and maximizing my damage. I do make a slight change when pushing the highest tier pits, but I'll go over those changes on another section in this video. And I do want to mention that I did remove my helmet, the Shaco, so it's a bit easier to see the skills I chose. So starting with the basic skills, I put 5 points into Bash, a point into Enhanced Bash, and a point into Combat Bash. And this is our main damage dealing skill that can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and melt bosses. And with Bash, we will also gain Fortify when hitting a stunned enemy, and Bash will allow our core skills to overpower if we critical strike 4 times with Bash. Next for the core skills, I put 1 point into Hammer of the Ancients, a point into Enhanced Hammer of the Ancients, and a point into Violent Hammer of the Ancients. And we're only taking this skill for the increased damage, which when we overpower with Hammer of the Ancients, you gain 30% more damage for 5 seconds. And this skill will greatly increase our damage. And because of our basic skill Bash, we can easily overpower this skill. Next for the defensive skills, I put a point into Rallying Cry, point into Enhanced Rallying Cry, and a point into Strategic Rallying Cry. And this skill is important because we'll gain Unstoppable, and this skill will also grant us Fortify. Next I put 3 points into Imposing Presence and 3 points into Martial Vigor, and these skills are really good for defense and survivability. And next I put 1 point into Outburst and 1 point into Tough as Nails, and we're only putting 1 point into these skills to gain some thorns, and when enemies hit you, they're applied bleeding damage, which will benefit from a glyph and a legendary node from the Paragon Board. Next for the brawling skills, I put 5 points into War Cry and a point into Enhanced War Cry, and this skill will greatly increase your damage and also grant you berserking. Next I put 3 points into Booming Voice, and this will increase the duration of your shout skills. And next I put 3 points into Aggressive Resistance, and this skill is really good for defense and survivability because it will grant you damage reduction while berserking. And next I put 3 points into Swiftness, and this will greatly increase your movement speed. Next for the weapon mastery skills, I put 1 point into Steel Grasp, a point into Enhanced Steel Grasp, and a point into Fighter Steel Grasp. And this skill is important because it will pull groups of enemies to you, and you will apply vulnerable to the enemies while also gaining berserking. Then I put 3 points into Pit Fighter and 3 points into Slaying Strike, and these skills will greatly increase your damage. Next I put 1 point into Thick Skin and 3 points into Counter Offensive, and because of our skills and our legendary aspects, we will gain Fortify, which then this skill will greatly increase your damage. Next for the ultimate skills, I put 1 point into Call of the Ancients and a point into Prime Call of the Ancients, and we're only using this ultimate skill for the increased bonus attack speed and the increased damage. Next I put 3 points into Heavy Handed and 3 points into Wallow, and these skills will greatly increase your damage. Now I didn't put any points into Concussion, and all these these points are coming from my tempered gear. But this skill is really good because when you lucky hit, you'll stun enemies for 3 seconds. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put a point into Unconstrained, and this will increase your berserking's duration, and it will also increase its damage bonus. Okay, and really quickly, if you want to know when to use your Hammer of the Ancients, you will see the icon on the bottom. So if you critical strike with Bash 4 times, you will see this icon. And this states at 4, your next core or weapon master skill will overpower. So once you see this, you want to use your Hammer of the Ancients, and then you'll see your damage is greatly increased. Okay, so next for the gear. Now I'm going to share a D4 build planner in the description below, but I'll share a build with Ubers using the Shaco and a build without Ubers if you don't have the Shaco. And I'll be going over the best stats and the legendary aspect. So starting with the helmet. Now the helmet I'm using is the Shaco, and this is just the best helmet in the game for every character because of its unique aspect, which states gain 20% damage reduction. In addition, gain +4 ranks to all skills. Next for the chest piece. Now ideally you're looking for strength, armor, and some sort of resistance, but you can also get the resistance on your pants and your boots, and you can swap out your resistance depending on which resistance you're needing. And same thing for the armor, because you just want to cap out your armor and all your resistance. And for the tempering, I got shadow resistance and plus ranks to concussion, and concussion is a really good skill because it will give you a chance to stun enemies. And the legendary aspect I'm using is when you cast a skill, you heal for 2% life, double this bonus while below 50% life, and this legendary aspect is really important for survivability. Next for the gloves, I'm using the unique gloves, the Pain Gorger's gauntlets, and these gloves are formed by defeating the boss, the beast in the ice. And these gloves are really strong because it gives you attack speed, critical strike chance, and increases your basic damage. And the unique aspect is damaging enemies with a non-basic skill cast marks them for 3 seconds. When a basic skill first hits a marked enemy, the basic skill's damage is echoed to all marked enemies, dealing 200% increased damage. Next for the pants. Now you're looking for strength and plus ranks to bash, and you can get either armor, resistance, or maximum life. But if you capped out your armor and all your resistance, then you want to get maximum life. And for the tempering, I'm using poison resistance to cap out my poison resistance and plus ranks to concussion. And the legendary aspect I have is lucky hit, up to a 35% chance to gain 2206 fortify whenever you deal direct damage while berserking. And this legendary aspect is really good to gain fortify. And next for the boots, you're looking for movement speed, strength, and either resistance or armor depending on what you need. And for the tempering, I'm using lucky hit, up to a 28.9% chance to freeze for 2 seconds. Now I'm also using a 13.1% increased movement speed. Now for this build, I did want to cap out my movement speed, which makes it good to dodge any attacks and for speed farming. And getting the lucky hit to freeze enemies is really good for crowd control. Next for the two-handed mace, you're looking for strength, maximum life, and critical strike damage. And this is the most important tempering that you want for all your weapons, is bash cleaves for 253.8 damage. And just be aware, the tempering with bash cleaves is multiplicative damage, so this will greatly increase your damage. Now the second tempering, you can either get critical strike damage or damage to close enemies. Now damage to close enemies is better if you plan not to use the grandfather sword, but if you plan to use the grandfather sword in the future, then it's better to get critical strike damage. And the legendary aspect I have is that basic skills gain 60% attack speed. Now for the one-handed weapons, you want to use a sword because its base stats grant you critical strike damage, and the stats you're looking for is strength, maximum life, and critical strike damage. And for the tempering, you're looking for bash cleaves for damage and either critical strike damage or damage to close enemies. And the legendary aspect I'm using is skills deal up to 20% increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast, receiving the maximum benefit while you have full primary resource. And you want the same stats for the second one-handed weapon, so using a sword for the base critical strike damage and also getting strength, maximum life, and critical strike damage. And for the tempering, you want bash cleaves for damage and either damage to close enemies or critical strike damage. And for the legendary aspect I have, whenever you deal direct damage while berserking, inflict 30% of its base damage dealt as additional bleeding damage over 5 seconds. Now for the two-handed slashing weapon, you're looking for a two-handed sword because of its base stats critical strike damage. And like before, you're looking for strength, maximum life, and critical strike damage for its stats. And for the tempering, you're looking for bash cleaves for damage and either critical strike damage or damage to close enemies. And for the legendary aspect, I'm using damaging an enemy with basic skills grant you 4% attack speed for 10 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. Upon reaching maximum stacks, you enter a vampiric blood rage, gaining 160% basic skill damage and 15% movement speed for 10 seconds. And this legendary aspect aspect will greatly increase your attack speed. Next, for the amulet, you're looking for movement speed, attack speed, cooldown reduction, or critical strike chance. And for the tempering, damage while berserking is used to cap out one of the legendary nodes on the Paragon board, which will greatly increase your damage. And I'm also using the movement speed tempering to cap out my movement speed. And the legendary aspect I'm using is when cast below 50% maximum resource, basic skills generate 3 of your primary resource once per cast. When cast at or above 50% maximum resource, basic skills deal 120% increased damage. And this legendary aspect will greatly increase our damage. Next, for the rings. Now for the stats, you want attack speed and critical strike chance. And for the third stat, you can either get strength or maximum life. And for the tempering, I'm using war cry, cooldown reduction, and damage while berserking. Now I'm only using damage while berserking so I can cap out one of the legendary nodes on the Paragon board to maximize my damage. And for the legendary aspect, it states deal 10% increased damage. Triple this bonus after standing still for 3 seconds. And this legendary aspect will greatly increase our damage. Now for the second ring, the stats I have is strength, attack speed, and critical strike chance. And for the tempering, I'm using war cry, cooldown reduction, and increased critical strike damage. And for the legendary aspect, I have gained 30% increased damage to a set of damage types for 7 seconds. This effect alternates between 2 sets: fire, lightning, and physical, cold, poison, and shadow. Now with this legendary aspect, we will only gain the increased damage every other 7 seconds, but the 30% increased damage is really strong. And if you don't have the Shaco, then you can use the Tusk Helm of Jorts the Mighty. This is a good alternate helmet because it gives you attack speed and ranks to aggressive resistance, which is really good for survivability. And its unique aspect is really good for gaining increased damage and cooldown reduction. Okay, and really quickly for the gems. Now you're looking for ruby gems on your armor pieces to gain maximum life. And for the weapon, you want to use topaz gems to increase your basic damage. And for the jewelry, you want to use gems to cap out your resistance. So I'm using 2 diamond gems and 1 ruby gem to cap out all my resistance. And as you can see, I have 10,362 armor, which caps out my armor because all you need is 9,230 armor. And if you check out my resistance, all my resistance is capped out. And if you check out my movement speed is capped out at 200%. And having capped out movement speed, I can easily speed farm any content and dodge all of Uber Lilith's mechanics very easily. Okay, so next for the Paragon board. Now this is a fully optimized Paragon board at level 100, and all my glyphs are maxed out at level 21. And with this Paragon board, I did focus on damage, getting as much maximum health as possible, and capping out all my resistance. And because all my glyphs are maxed out, it's actually better to increase your stats that benefit your glyph. But I'm just going to quickly go over this Paragon board, going over the glyphs, the legendary node, and the important rare nodes. So for the starter board, I'm using the Ire glyph. An additional bonus is while berserking, you take 10% reduced damage from elites. And you want to take this rare node, Tenacity, and these 2 magic nodes because these nodes will greatly increase your life. Then heading up this way, the next Paragon board I'm using is Carnage, and the glyph I'm using is Martial. An additional bonus is after casting a shout skill, the active cooldown of every other non-shout skill is reduced by 2 seconds. I also took the legendary node Carnage, which states while berserking, critical strikes increase your attack speed by 2% up to 16% for 6 seconds. And you want to take this rare node Cold Condition to max out your cold resistance. And for this Paragon board, I did split it into 2 directions. So first heading left this way, and the next Paragon board I'm using is Bonebreaker. And the glyph I'm using is Might. An additional bonus is that you'll deal 8% increased damage while wielding 2-handed weapons. And you want to take this rare node Tenacity and these 2 magic nodes because these nodes will greatly increase your life. Now heading back to the Carnage Paragon board and heading right this way. And the next Paragon board I'm using is Blood Rage. And the glyph I'm using is Revenge. An additional bonus states dealing thorns damage to an enemy increases all damage it takes from you by 1% up to 8% for 10 seconds. And because we're taking that 1 skill outburst from the skill tree, we can easily apply thorns damage to an enemy, and this will greatly increase our damage. I also took the legendary node Blood Rage, which states killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to grant berserking for 5 seconds. Your damage is increased by 10% of your damage while berserking bonus up to a maximum of 30%. Now the first part of this legendary node, which grants us a chance to grant berserking for 5 seconds, is not that important. What's important is the second part, which is your damage is increased by 10% of your damage while berserking bonus up to a maximum of 30%. And because of our gear that we tempered, which increases our damage while berserking, I was able to easily cap this out. As you can see, current bonus 30%. And you do want to take this rare node Restorative and these magic nodes to increase your maximum life. And this rare node is important, Fire Condition, to max out your fire resistance. Then heading right this way. And the last Paragon board I'm using is Decimator. And the glyph I'm using is Exploit. An additional bonus is when an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. This cannot happen more than once every 20 seconds per enemy. Now this glyph is useful because if the skill Steel Grasp is on cooldown or you miss the enemy, this glyph will apply vulnerable to enemies. And I'm also using the legendary node Decimator. And this states that each time you make an enemy vulnerable, your damage is increased by 10% for 5 seconds. Overpowering a vulnerable enemy grants you additional 10% bonus for 5 seconds. And you want to take this rare node Restorative and these 2 magic nodes to greatly increase your maximum life. And really quickly, the reason it's better to increase the stats on your glyph, because if you look at this glyph Ire, it states for every 5 strength purchase within range, you deal 5.3% increased damage while berserking, while this magic node will only give you a 5% damage while berserking increase. So as you can see, if you maxed out your glyph, it will be better to take the strength because strength will just generally increase your damage, and this will increase your damage while berserking more than the magic node. Now I did really quickly go over this Paragon board, but I'll have the full Paragon board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, and really quickly, if I'm planning to push the highest tier pits, I do switch out 1 skill. So I do take out the 2 skill points out of Call of the Ancients, and I put these 2 skill points into Challenging Shout and Enhanced Challenging Shout. And Challenging Shout will grant you damage reduction and bonus maximum life, which is really good for defense and survivability. But you do lose out in some attack speed and damage. And with these slight changes, you should be able to easily push the higher tier pits. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest, and fastest Bash Barbarian build in Season 4. With this build, you should easily clear tier 100 plus pits and destroy any Uber bosses. With this build, you should have very high movement speed, allowing you to dodge any attacks and speed clear any dungeons. And I'll have different build layouts in a D4 build planner in the description below, depending on your situation. Hope this helps and more Diablo 4 videos to come, so stay tuned. And of course,